I'd like to say hello to everybody at the Texas Children and Nature Summit. And I've been talking to Jennifer earlier this morning, and I'm really inspired by everything that you're doing, as I have been all along. And I think Texas is absolutely one of the epicenters of the Children and Nature movement, or the New Nature movement, as I sometimes call it, because it includes adults as well. But you have great leaders like you, Jennifer, and Carter Smith, and Nancy Herron, who is retired but not tired. She's on the national board of the Children Nature Network. Margaret Russell in Austin, Hayden Brooks, one of my favorite guys, Molly Stevens, a wonderful leader at West Cave, an amazing recent fundraiser, by the way, I understand. But also all of the institutions that are there that are doing extraordinary things. And I think that what Texas is really, in particular, leading the way on is being able to see a vision of lots of institutions and private organizations, as well as public, that are linked together. And this is really kind of following the model that we hoped people would follow, the idea of a network, and leveraging all of these institutions so that you reach many, many more of the kids in Texas. And in that way, you're setting an example for the country. I know there are 26 million people in Texas, and 7 million of those are children. At the most recent national conference of the Children of Nature Network, it was in Canada, and we drew around 900 attendees, I think. Many of them were from Texas. And I think on the opening night, I announced that we had 22 countries represented there. Actually, it was 21 countries, 22 if you count Texas. Texas holds a lot of sway, holds a lot of power in people's imagination and in reality. So what you're doing there in leveraging all of these organizations, and in particular private landowners, I think that's very, very important, because there's a limit to what public government, to what public institutions can do. That increasingly, I think we're going to have to look to Texas, because you have so little public land relative to other states, that you're going to teach the rest of us how to maximize private land and private concerns to make sure that every kid gets out into nature. I think that, I've always talked about my three-ring theory of social change, which is that too often we rely really too much on the nonprofits that connect people to nature, and including the parks and all of that, they cannot do it alone. Schools cannot do it alone. The first ring, as I often say, are the organizations, the nonprofits. The second ring is often the volunteers, the docents, the people who are always there and always help. Both of those rings of social change depend on many of the same funders. And so the third ring, it seems to me, is a way to extend and build on the work of the first two rings. And the third ring are things that people create on their own, like family nature clubs. Family nature club idea, as many of you know, is that parents are very scared of stranger danger, even though the statistics really don't, in most neighborhoods, not all, but most neighborhoods don't support that fear. But that fear is not going to go away. I had that fear. My wife had that fear, even though we knew better when we were raising our kids. So we have to figure out, I think, ways of what I would call self-replicating social change, things that are contagious, out beyond the institutions, out beyond the schools and the organizations, that actually build constituency, both social constituency and political constituency, for the parks, for the schools that are adding natural play spaces, for the policymakers that support this idea. I think going into our schools and speaking up for the natural teachers there, teachers who do take their students out no matter what. And they've always been there. And we hope there are more of them now to really support those natural teachers. We can do that as individual parents and grandparents and individuals. Make sure the principal knows that we appreciate that, or the school board. I know there's a movement in Texas afoot to create more natural play areas from the Rio Grande Valley that's putting in natural play areas at the elementary schools to in Houston, Austin, and Lubbock. The Texas Department of Health Services has created an outdoor learning partnership with TCM to create more spaces like that, natural spaces, working with one of my heroes, or two of my heroes, Robin Moore and Nilda Costco, with the environmental initiative to create more natural play spaces. San Antonio Zoo, San Antonio Botanical Gardens are adding outdoor learning areas that are just going to be terrific. Houston has the initiative through Every Kid in a Park. You've managed to get a $100,000 grant, which is terrific, to help Title I schools get kids out to local parks. Nancy Herron and you, Jennifer, helped write that grant. That's very important. And I was mentioning to you earlier that I was talking to one of the people in the Obama White House just a couple of days ago about the need to support legislation to make Every Kid in a Park permanent. But what you're doing also is so important. Legislation alone can't do it. There have to be these active partnerships with schools. It's not going to happen accidentally, and it's not going to happen unless people like you make it happen. Also, the National League of Cities and the Children Nature Network have this partnership called Cities Connecting Children with Nature. And Margaret Lamar in Texas is leading that. That's a very, very important effort. Austin is one of those cities. And if we can begin to have cities like Austin and other cities in Texas become models for cities everywhere to connect kids to nature, that's just extraordinarily important. And that's a real example of leveraging this grassroots movement into something much larger. I've often talked about the idea of a homegrown national park, which is Doug Tallamy's original idea. I'd like to see this on a worldwide basis, which I call the homegrown worldwide park, where people begin to change their yards, or the schoolyard, or the churchyard, any private land that can be turned into native species that increases the biodiversity of a city. I believe that cities can become engines of biodiversity, and that begins with providing the native plants that really feed the food chain. But what if it wasn't just our yard? What if it's the next yard, next? And pretty soon you'd have wildlife corridors going through out the city and maybe connecting to other cities. And that would help slow down at least, and maybe even prevent the biodiversity collapse. One of the fundamental things that we can do. So why not declare a homegrown national park or a worldwide homegrown park? Why couldn't that really start in a big way in Texas, because you have so much private land? And this movement, the new nature movement, I think has the potential, perhaps more than any other movement, to help people imagine not just, as I say, a sustainable future, but a nature-rich future. The nature in our lives is at the center of the possibility of a great future. And I think that's part of the great work, part of the goal of this movement and of everything that you're doing there with Texas Children and Nature, and at your summit, I think in some way is focused on providing a vision of that future that is so different from the post-apocalyptic vision of the future we seem to be accepting as a culture. We can't accept that, because if we do, we're guaranteed to get that dystopian future. But there is an alternative. In Texas Children in Nature, you all are building that alternative every day. I think many of us watched with horror what was happening to Houston and much of Texas with the hurricane. And many of us were inspired by how Texans helped each other and how devastating it was, and yet how hopeful it seems when you see so many Texans coming to each other's rescue. That, I think, restores our faith in many ways in our culture. I think it shows us that even in the face of terrible catastrophe, there's always hope, that there's really no practical alternative to hope. And I think that Texas has proved that once again in the recent months. And our hearts have gone out to you, but you've also inspired us. Texas certainly stands out in that it does have, city efforts, city initiatives, and regional initiatives. But to the extent that those initiatives have been networked and that are part of something larger at a statewide level, particularly a state as populated and as large as Texas, I think that's fairly unique. And I think it's a model for the rest of the country.